was 8 years old and grew up in a working class family. All of these identities and the respective positions of privilege and oppression that he occupies in his life shape his social justice work. Daniel is an accomplished consultant. He founded his own firm, Daniel Lynn Consulting, in 2012, which has worked with government agencies, nonprofits, and universities from around the country to build regenerative cultures and advance racial and social justice. And sorry, I'm just going to pause real quick because I need to be recording. Oh, we are recording. Excellent. Sorry for the interruption. His practice is strongly rooted in ecological systems thinking. His biggest passion in life is to help humans live in regenerative relationship with our more than human kin and the land and achieve collective liberation for all living things. He studied ecological design and permaculture at the University of Vermont, receiving a BS in natural resources, and urban planning and environmental justice at Pratt Institute, receiving an MS in city and regional planning. He is a McNair Scholar, and he lives with his husband in Brooklyn. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Rima. Good morning to everyone. I am so excited to be back here on the second day of the conference and to be giving this training. That's really a continuation of yesterday's talk on what race is and what systemic racism looks like. But if you weren't able to attend that, that's okay. I'll be going over that really quickly as a way to transition into the main topic for today. So as Rima mentioned, I do have an urban planning background. I have an urban planning degree from Pratt Institute, and I was an urban planner very briefly early in my career. So I am in familiar community, I'm in familiar territory, and I am very well aware of the various issues that sort of face the planning field, especially as it relates to race and racism and racial justice. And this is a topic that we have needed to talk about for a long time as a society. And so I am glad that the AP and New York Upstate chapter and really organizations around the country are really talking about this topic again, especially because of the events that transpired over the summer. And so I'm glad to be given this training, and I look forward to engaging with you all. I want to start off with an Indigenous land acknowledgement, the same thing that I did yesterday, in case folks who weren't here yesterday, I wanted to show them what that experience is like. So this time we're going to do it in a different way. We're going to be more interactive. So I am posting a link here in the chat box. It's native-land.ca. So if you could go to that website really quickly and type in your address. It could be your home address. It could be your work address. Just put in an address that's meaningful to you, whatever that is. And then paste in the Zoom chat box the name of the Indigenous people whose land you live or work on currently, right? And as you do that, I'm going to talk about the land acknowledgement. So we deal with issues of land use as urban planners. And so if we're serious about being anti-racist planners and dismantling racism in urban planning, one of the things we have to reckon with is how we got this land that make up the United States, the state of New York, and all the local municipalities where you work and where we all work. And the truth is, we got this land from stealing it from the Indigenous people that were here before us. We committed genocide against Native people, and we did that through colonialism, disease warfare, and ultimately land theft. And we forcibly moved Indigenous people onto reservations located on the harshest lands. And so we currently live on much of unceded territory of Indigenous tribes across New York State and across this country. So an Indigenous land acknowledgement is really the first step in acknowledging this violent history of how we got this land, and to really start having conversations about decolonization and repatriation of land to Indigenous people. And what an acknowledgement is simply an acknowledgement of the land that you currently live and work on. So I'm normally based in Brooklyn, New York, and that is the unceded territory and ancestral homelands of the Lenape Canarsie people. And I've asked you to identify the lands that you all are currently on. And so thank you so much for doing that. And you're all in the state of New York, so there isn't much of a variety. That there's the same names keep popping up, right? Haudenosaunee, Mohican, Senecan, Onondaga, Mohawk. So I'm currently based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and that is the unceded territory and ancestral homelands of many different indigenous tribes, including the Navajo, the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Pueblo. And so I invite you to really learn about the indigenous people and the land that you live on. And in your urban planning work, start to really think about how indigenous people can be an integral part of how we plan, design, and develop these lands, right? And thank you so much for doing that. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see. To start the training. So this training is called How to Be an Anti-Racist Planner. Because this is a training and you will all be engaging each other in lots of different conversations and interactivity, I do want to set some ground rules. I call them brave space conversation agreements. And so brave space, you might have heard of the term safe space. I use the term brave space, which is slightly different. Brave spaces are temporary conversation spaces in which people have courage and the safety to engage authentically. So there are 6 agreements that I would like all of us to hold in order to create a successful brave space for the next 90 minutes. The first one is called make space, take space. So what that means is just be mindful of how much airtime you're taking up or not taking up. If you're someone who tends to talk a lot, for whatever reason, right? You're conditioned to be that way. You have to think out loud. Just be mindful of how much airtime you're taking up and give space to other people to talk. If you're someone who tends to be more quiet, uh, be mindful of that as well, and maybe share an insight that you have not heard from the group yet. Every voice is important, and we want to hear your voice as well. The second is when you're speaking, try to be concise. Again, we're talking about race, racism, and racial justice, which are really complex topics. There's 400 years of history, and there's statistics, there's data, there's also personal stories, our own stories, right? So things get really messy and complex really quickly. And so we understand, or I understand, that it's not always possible to speak concisely, but whenever you can, try to speak concisely so that you make more airtime for other people to speak. And when you're listening, we're trained in our society really to just be waiting for our turn to speak, right? When we're listening, we're not really engaging in deep listening. We're just waiting for our turn to speak. And when we're listening, we're often trained to figure out who's saying the right thing. Am I right? Are you right? Who's wrong? Who's correct here? Don't worry about that. Try to really listen to understand where the other person's coming from. What's their life story? Why do they believe what they do? And why do I believe what I do? And see if there's common ground, and see also if there's differences, right? So it's basically the act of active listening. Try not to listen in order to debate or argue, but listen to really understand first. The fourth agreement is embracing complexity and divergence. Again, this conversation can become really complex, and there's lots of contradictions, and there's also cognitive dissonance, right? Especially within ourselves. We believe consciously in one thing, we value one thing, but our behavior says something else, and that's okay. We have to be willing to lean into the discomfort, and the discomfort of knowing that we're all human beings. We make mistakes. We don't always live up to our values. We can believe in one thing and then act differently. And all of that is just part of being human. And so we have to learn to embrace complexity within the conversation of the group and also within ourselves, and be okay with divergence, be okay with disagreement, right? The fifth is honor intent and attend to impact. So what that means is I'm going to assume that we're all here with good intentions, and on a daily basis, we do things with good intentions. But at the same time, because of all the systems of oppression and privilege that we live in, our good intentions don't always translate to actual good impact, right? We want to do something good, but we actually end up doing something harmful to other people, especially marginalized groups. And so it's important to both honor intent and attend to the harmful impact that we might create. Both are important. Neither one can succumb the other. Finally, we'll be sharing a lot of personal stories with each other. So what I always say is, when it comes to personal stories, always uphold confidentiality. Do not share other people's personal stories without their permission. You're free to share your own insights, your own stories, and what you learned, right? Your general experience of the training. But when it comes to people's personal stories that you heard, please do not share them outside of the training, right? The idea of what happens here stays here. Uh, I want you to take away your lessons and your insights, but definitely keep the personal stories in this training, right? So yesterday I talked in length about systemic racism. So in order to really set up this training, I want to go over what that is again. What is systemic racism? So the key word is systemic. Racism is not just individuals with prejudice or racial bigotry. It's not, uh, you know, any one person in society that's perpetuating racism. In fact, racism is a structural phenomenon. It is built into the way this society is built. So racism is really the ideology, the belief of white supremacy that has been imbued with cultural, economic, and political power. And racism is all of the social systems put together that perpetuate the exploitation and the domination of what we call people of color and concentrating wealth and power among what we call white people. So racism is largely structural, and within that structure, within this all these social systems that we live in, there exist all of us as individuals who are unwilling participants in the structure of racism. Because we live in a structurally racist society, all of us are conditioned based on our own positions of power and privilege to either be complicit or actively participate in racism, right? So racism as a system really is driven by two things. One is the ideology of racism to start. You can call it white supremacy. So white supremacy as a belief system, you need that to start the whole cycle, the whole system. And that ideology alone does not amount to much. It's just prejudice, and all human beings have prejudice. It's when that prejudice, that ideology becomes imbued with structural power, right? The power of the government, the power of banks and businesses, the power of our school systems, the power of our police systems, the power of really all of our systems. When that racist ideology becomes imbued with all of the structural power of society, that's when you get the system of racism. So prejudice without power is just prejudice, and we all have it. But it's when prejudice plus power, that's when you get racism or the system of racism, right? And within that structure are all the individuals that engage in interpersonal bigotry and also experience internalized subordination. So if racism is a system, then racial justice and anti-racism is also a systemic act. Racial justice and racial justice and anti-racist practice is not an individual act. We all need to practice it as individuals, but it ultimately is a systemic act. It's an act of systemic transformation. So just to give a few examples of what systemic racism in planning looks like, planning agencies, nonprofits, and firms that are predominantly white, with workplaces that are often hostile to people of color. Uh, that is a phenomenon, it's a manifestation of systemic racism in planning. Planning processes that ignore and exclude communities of color. Again, it's a structural issue. Of course, there are individual planners and individual agents and actors who might have bigotry, but for the most part, systemic racism is built into the planning field and the planning processes themselves. The processes themselves are already designed to create racist outcomes by ignoring and excluding communities of color. And of course, there are actual racist outcomes like the disinvestment in communities of color over the decades. and the concentration of environmental burdens like highways, sewage treatment plants, and really toxic factories that are highly concentrated in communities of color, whereas a lot of the environmental amenities, right, like clean air, open spaces, parks, are often allocated to affluent white communities. So there's no one bad person doing all of this. It's the entire system, it's the entire field that is engaging in racist processes that ultimately create racist outcomes. So just as I said earlier a few minutes ago, if racism is a systemic phenomenon, then racial justice is also a systemic phenomenon. It's an act of systemic change. And so just as there are 4 levels of racism, there's also 4 levels of racial justice work or racial justice initiatives. And we'll talk about these in relation to being a planner, right? So we start again with ideology. Everything starts with ideology. And so to practice racial justice, we need to start with anti-racist mindset. And then that mindset really helps you all build liberatory structures. So in racism, we have structural oppression, structures that oppress. In racial justice, we have structures that liberate and that create equity. And then from there comes the individuals, all of us as individuals who live in all these social systems. What do we need to do as individuals? We need to build courageous and humble relationships. And we'll talk about what that means for us as planners. And then personal liberation, I'll describe here really quickly, but we won't get into that today because it's not quite relevant to the work of planning, although it's super relevant for you all as human beings. So personal liberation really means we're all complicit and participating in systems of racism because that's the larger society. We kind of have no choice. And so we have to actively practice liberation within ourselves. So for people of color, that means dismantling internalized racism. For white people, it means dismantling the internalized sense of white superiority, becoming a white ally. And so there's a lot of personal psychological work, a lot of healing work, a lot of um, sort of self-liberation work that needs to be done. And so we won't get into that today, but I will talk about the first 3 forms, which are more relevant to planning. So how do you become an anti-racist planner and how do you maintain being an anti-racist planner? One is to cultivate an anti-racist mindset. The second is, again, those liberating structures, employing planning processes that liberate and enfranchise people of color. And third, cultivating relationships that repair racial harm, especially historical racial harm, and building trust from your position of privilege. So let's start with the anti-racist mindset. What is it? A lot of us think we just have to be not racist, and then racism will be ended. And I want to really distinguish the difference between the not racist mindset versus the anti-racist mindset. So not racist on the surface sounds ideal, like no one wants to be racist. I don't want to be racist, except that it's based on that mindset is really operating on two really critically flawed assumptions. The not racist mindset really believes that racism is not a systemic phenomenon. It assumes that racism occurs on an interpersonal level when individual people engage in racist behavior. Oh, that bad police officer, or that bad boss, or that bad neighbor who is spouting racist rhetoric, right, on his social media. And so that's how most people see racism. And we're trained to see racism that way because it's very easy to target one person and say they're the bad person rather than say indict the whole system when really racism is a structural phenomenon. And so the not racist mindset just assumes, okay, if racism occurs on an interpersonal level, then as long as a person is not actively engaging in racist behavior, racism will not occur. So of course, if you believe in that, then it leads you to say, well, as long as I'm not racist, racism will not occur. And that's simply not how racism works. And so the idea of not being racist is not only inaccurate, it's actually ineffective in ending systemic racism, which is why social justice consultants and activists and social justice workers really say we cannot strive for not being racist. Society trains us and conditions us to be racist. So what we have to do instead is actively be anti-racist. Racism is a pervasive feature of our society, so we have to actively dismantle it within ourselves, within our relationships, and within the social institutions that we all live and work in. And so anti is an active prefix, right? It's not a passive prefix. We're not just not being racist, we're actively resisting racism, we're actively interrupting it, we're actively dismantling it. So what does an anti-racist mindset really operate on? It operates on recognizing that our social institutions are really designed to create racist outcomes. In other words, structural racism. And it recognizes that all people, by virtue of living in a structurally racist society, carry racial bias. I am a racial justice consultant. This is what I do for a living. I've been doing it for nearly a decade. And I can admit that I also carry racial bias because I live in a structurally racist society. On any given day, I carry any number of racial biases that are playing around in my head and that influence how I interact with people of different races. And I can admit that because I have an anti-racist mindset. So uh, it's very important for you all as planners to also adopt an anti-racist mindset and recognize that you and everyone around you carry racial bias. It's not helpful to pretend or assume that we're not biased. That's naive and it's also not true, right? And so what's more helpful is just to acknowledge that people carry racial bias and then actually work to address it rather than pretend or assume that we don't carry racial bias. And then finally, the anti-racist mindset really recognizes that to end racism, we have to dismantle the entire system of racism, not just stop at individual behavior. I can't say at the end of every day, oh, well, I was not racist today, so I'm all good. My responsibility ends there. That's not good enough because the larger system of racism continues. And so in our lives and our work, we have to be actively dismantling racism whenever we can, using whatever position of privilege and power we occupy. So how do you cultivate an anti-racist mindset in planning? There's really two things. Two main ways. One is to build your understanding of structural racism by reading up, doing a lot of reading. It takes really a lifetime of reading. So go slow, start now. Don't don't worry about reading 15 books a month or a year. Go slow, but start now, right? Reading up on the history of racial zoning, redlining, environmental injustice, and all the other instances of racism in urban planning. It doesn't have to be limited to urban planning. You can read about social justice literature uh, from society in general, and you'll learn so much about how urban planning plays a role in it. Learn to anticipate and assess for racially disproportionate impact of planning decisions, especially those that seem race neutral on the surface. So part of having an anti-racist mindset in your work as urban planners is at any given moment when you're doing an assignment, when you're doing a community project, the first thing you should do is start to think about what is the potential racially disproportionate impact of your actions and of the issue that's being discussed or promoted, right? Whether that's food access, transportation, biking, housing. There's racism is so pervasive in the society. It's almost always present in urban planning discussions. So rather than assume that by default their race does not play a role, assume that race does play a role because of the history of this country, and learn to assess for racially disproportionate impact as part of your planning work. So we go from the anti-racist mindset to building liberatory structures. So what does that look like? How do we design liberatory structures in planning? Uh, there's a couple of things. One is to design planning processes that really center the voices and expertise of marginalized groups, especially low-income communities of color. What does that look like in practice? designing planning processes where marginalized groups really get to define the planning parameters and agenda, identify their assets and their needs on their own terms, and articulate their visions. And for some of you, this might seem like, well, duh, that's pretty obvious, that's common sense. But the history of planning shows that we don't actually do that, right? A lot of planning agencies and planning organizations are white dominant, and there's a lot of white planners. And their attitude is, well, we're the ones with the planning degree, we're the ones with the education, we're the ones with the expert knowledge. We can identify what's an asset for a community. We can identify what the community needs. They don't really engage in true community engagement to really learn from the community's perspective. And so they sort of define the planning parameters. Here's the here's the process, and here's the agenda. This is what we're going to accomplish, and the community is just being dragged along in that process. And that's how we have done planning for a long time. And most times we don't even engage communities at all. We just plan for the community and we say, well, here's a plan for your neighborhood. This is what we know to be the best route for your community. You just have to buy into it, right? So a lot of times we don't engage communities at all. And that kind of top-down planning is really perpetuating systemic racism. Um, so if we were to design planning processes where marginalized groups are really at the center and they're actually leading the conversation, they also get to engage in generative conflict and develop mutually beneficial outcomes for competing interests. So this is again centering the process on marginalized groups. A lot of times what we as planners do in our top-down approach is, let's say we do outreach and then we engage communities and we hear from different groups about what they need. We are still the ultimate decision makers. We make, using our own data and our own parameters, we decide, well, okay, this group will get this, that other group will get that. We're the ones making the decisions on how to prioritize the community's needs. Rather than do that, actually allow the communities to engage each other in in having disagreements and having conflict and developing mutually beneficial outcomes. So developing planning events, community gatherings, and really facilitating excellently. So you have to improve your facilitation skills as well to really allow for this to happen. Create facilitation experiences where marginalized groups don't end up fighting with each other, but actually learning to develop mutually beneficial outcomes with each other, right? So this idea of scarcity, this idea of competition is also part of white supremacy. Oh. And so there's a different way to plan, there's a different way to build cities, and that's through collaboration, that's through mutual aid. And we're seeing a lot of that now, especially in the COVID era that we're living in. Mutual aid is more important than ever. So rather than engage in the traditional competition approach, we need to develop mutually beneficial outcomes. The other part of designing liberatory structures is ensuring that planning outcomes result in the equitable distribution of wealth, power, and resources for all stakeholders. Um, and on this slide, I want to really define various terms that may be interchangeably used when they really should not be. So in social justice, we really promote the terms equity and justice rather than equality, which is what a lot of people in society strive for. And the difference is equity and justice acknowledges the impact of historical oppression. They're directly responding to historical oppression. That's what equity means. That's what justice means. They're recognizing that there's an injustice at some point in history that's still relevant. And so equitable solutions and equitable distribution of wealth, power, and resources is responsive to that history. Whereas equality ignores that history. It ignores the history of inequality and assumes that we're all starting from the same place. All human beings at this moment in time are starting from the same place. And so as long as you treat everyone the same and offer same treatment, then we have achieved social justice, we have achieved social equality. And again, that sounds ideal, but it's actually inaccurate and it's ineffective because it ignores the long multi-century history of inequality. So here are 3 graphics based around the idea of people wanting to watch a baseball game, that really distinguish equality from equity and justice, and this more radical term called liberation. And you may have seen this graphic or versions of these graphics in previous spaces. So there's a lot of different versions of this graphic out there. I don't like all of them. I particularly like this one, and I encourage the use of this one that was created by Cultural Organizing, the group called Cultural Organizing, because they really speak to the structural and systemic phenomenon at play. So if you look at these graphics, you'll notice several things. One, there's a fence, and that fence is not equal height, right? That fence is uneven height. And the fence is really speaking to the existing present day barriers to access. So the fence is meant to keep people out. So it's a symbol of barriers of access. And it's uneven because that's really how society is. We don't all face the same barriers of access. Different people have lower barriers and other people have higher barriers, right? The other symbolism in this graphic is the uneven green ground. So again, that the unevenness is really important here because the ground is representing history. We're not all starting from the same history. A lot people of color have experienced centuries of oppression and injustice and disenfranchisement and marginalization, whereas white people have experienced centuries of privilege and power and enfranchisement. And so we're not starting from the same place. We're starting from vastly different starting points that put some people ahead and other people at a disadvantage, right? And the boxes really symbolize the solutions, the planning solutions that are supposed to respond to this inequality that we're observing. And so equality, if we think of it in terms of equality, equal planning, equal opportunity, then what it really just says is we're going to give everyone the same thing and assume that they're all going to lead to the same outcome. And as you can see in the graphic, it doesn't lead to the same outcome just because you give every child the same box. Um, and that is the flaw of the equality thinking. It ignores the history, it ignores the different barriers of access that people experience, and just assumes that everyone has equal experience of life. And so as long as you give people the same thing, the same amount, they will benefit in the same amount, right? And that's simply not accurate. So what equity and justice really speak to is that uneven ground, that uneven history of oppression, and the uneven fence, the uneven barriers of access that different demographic groups experience. So equity says you have to give some more to some and less to others because other people need less and other people need more because of the history of oppression. And I want to be very clear here that equity and justice really speak to oppression, right? There's a history of oppression that put certain people back at a disadvantage, and offering more resources to those people is in direct response to oppression. It's in direct response to historical injustice. So it's not about unfairly giving some people more and some people less out of, let's say, compassion or generosity or some bias. Although I promote a society that's based on compassion, but equity and justice really speak to, okay, these people have experienced oppression, so we know that they're at a disadvantage. So we need to give them more in an equitable fashion. We can't do equal treatment. We have to do equitable treatment. So equity and justice are really speaking to oppression. And then liberation is not something we'll get to today, but it is this idea that society should not be built around barriers of access at all, should not be built around hierarchies, should not be built around limiting access for certain people. Let's break down the barriers of access and sort of create a society that's really liberated so that all people can start to heal from the system of oppression and can really participate and self-actualize to their full potential. And so what does liberation look like in urban planning? It's about breaking down systems of barriers of access. So for example, healthcare, not exactly an urban planning issue, but in the United States, healthcare is a barrier of access to a lot of people because of the private insurance system. And so to liberate that system means getting rid of that private health insurance system and creating a single payer system. An example more related to urban planning is access to public transportation, right? Some cities and some places offer free transportation. That's a liberated system. Whereas many cities, especially New York City where I live, uses a fare system where you have to pay to access the system. And so you can create equitable solutions around a fare-based system, but why not just get rid of the fare-based system in general and create funding and investments and budgets to support the subway system through some other means. And so liberation can sound really radical, and just talking about it right now might have triggered some of you and make you uncomfortable about challenging your core beliefs. But I really encourage you to think about liberated systems as like the frontier of social justice work, because we already have examples of that around healthcare, around transportation, around police services, right? Not talking about police violence at all, but just police services as a service. No one pays privately for police. No one pays privately for firefighter services. It's a social service that's given freely to all based on a tax system. And so that's a liberated system, ironically. So that's what it means to be striving for liberation. So building courageous and humble relationships and planning. So we've gone from the anti-racist mindset. We moved on to building liberating structures, and now it comes down to individual acts, the relationships that we have with other people within this larger system that we live in. So what does that look like in planning to build courageous and humble relationships? One is to re-examine your role as an expert, as a savior, as a fixer, right? Where a lot of us as planners are trained to think of ourselves in those roles. We have the education, we have the master's degree, we know what we're talking about. The communities don't have the expertise. And that's really not true. I was an urban planner briefly in my early career, and whenever I worked with communities, I instantly recognized how little I knew about the communities that I was supposed to be working with. I have my education. I know planning theory. I know planning concepts. I know the latest urban planning trends, what's good, what's not good. But I really don't know the community, and I don't know what they need. I don't know their strengths. I don't know their hopes and dreams and aspirations. I don't know their fears. I don't know the injustices that they're experiencing. And so as a planner, I have to re-examine my role about what am I there to do in my work. So building courageous and humble relationships really looks like listening and giving communities of color, and really all communities, the resources that they ask for, right? And trust that they know how to use them and follow their leadership. So if you were at my talk yesterday, one of the ideology that really defines the history, the tradition of urban planning is we don't trust communities. We especially don't trust communities of color. We don't trust that they know what to do. We don't trust that they know how to use the tools and resources that we give them. Except time and time again, we know that communities do know what they need for themselves, what they want for their future, and they know how to use the money that are given to them. They know how to use the resources that are given to them. So re-examining our role as experts really means trusting that communities know how to use the resources and the money that are given to them. And we need to follow their leadership rather than telling them to follow our leadership. And that means collaborating, committing to a collaborative process and avoiding top-down planning. This is where the humility comes in. You have to be willing to take a step back and say, I don't know everything. In fact, I don't know a lot of things about this community. The community knows best about themselves. Let's be in equal partnership with communities. Let's be in equal partnership with nonprofit leaders that are already working in those communities, and do this work together. And it takes a very radical shift in our mindset. We have to unlearn the way we've been trained to be planners. And the third point is reflecting on the limits of your expert knowledge, which I already spoke to. learning to embrace the community's expertise. Building courageous and humble relationships also involves using your intersectional positions of privilege to be an ally and act in solidarity. So we have not defined what intersectionality or intersectional means, so I'll define it here really quickly. Intersectional just means we don't just have one identity. I'm not just my race, right? I'm not just Asian. I also have my gender. I also have my sexual orientation. I also have my socioeconomic class. I also have my education. I have various other identities, and all of you are not just your race, or not just your gender, or not just your class. You have various other identities as well. And all of those identities place you in a position of privilege related to that identity. So for me, I don't necessarily have white privilege because I'm not white, but I do have gender privilege. I have male privilege because I'm a cisgender man. And I have some level of class or socioeconomic privilege because I was able to get an advanced degree. I was able to uh, learn English and speak English fluently. And so I occupy various positions of privilege based on my various identities. So I want you to think about all of your different identities and the different positions of power and privilege that those identities give you or don't give you. And use those positions of privilege, whatever you have, to get vulnerable and learn to participate in really difficult conversations on race and racism. So a lot of folks want to reconcile racial discord and say, why can't we all just get along? And that is disingenuous. You can't reconcile without acknowledging the history of racism. And that's why a lot of countries engage in truth and reconciliation processes, like Canada, like South America, South Africa, and New Zealand. They have all engaged in truth and reconciliation processes with the history of indigenous genocide. And that is what is needed to actually repair harm and learn to build trust and actually move beyond race and racism and start to reconcile and build relationships. And so we have to be willing to engage in really difficult conversations on the history of racism, engage in truth and reconciliation. And that means listening humbly. We can't just say, why do we have to talk about race? Why can't we just get along now? Well, it doesn't work that way because racism is a systemic phenomenon that has roots in 400 years of history in this country. So when it comes to this level of doing anti-racist work, it really involves us as planners engaging in repairing harm. The communities that you work with probably have experienced racial harm from centuries, right? And there was a question yesterday about how do we work with communities that don't want to participate? There's a reason why they don't want to participate, and that's because when they have tried to participate, these planning processes that are really damaging to communities of color, they have consistently been harmed by these processes. So why should they continue to participate in processes that don't benefit them? Why should they trust you when all they know is this intergenerational memory of consistently being ignored, being harmed by the planning processes that you're now promoting? And so in order for communities to really learn to trust you and engage you in the planning processes, you have to get vulnerable, listen to them, hear their stories, and repair harm, and learn to build trust. All right. So those are the three levels at which we can all be anti-racist planners. One, we have to develop an anti-racist mindset through reading, through having conversations, and learning to assess for racially disproportionate impact. And then from there, we have to build actual structures, planning processes, and create planning outcomes that result in equity. And we also, in the process of our work, we have to develop relationships with people of color, with communities of color that are based on acknowledging truth, repairing harm, and building relationships that are really rooted in trust and humility, right? So I want to now engage us all in a breakout group exercise. So I'm going to send you a link via the chat box in a few minutes where you can download an equity analysis tool. And I want to break you all out into small groups where you can work together to do an equity analysis around a particular urban planning issue. So there's all types of urban planning issues out there, and I'm sure all of you work on these different issues. So just to give some inspiration, I listed about, I don't see, 12 different examples or 16 different examples: public transit, highway development, bike path development, housing, retail development, you name it. There's so many different urban planning issues. And so what we want to do is, as a group, as a breakout group, just choose one topic. And you may not all know each other, and you may not know what each other works on. And so don't think too hard. Just choose a topic that the 3 or 4 of you can agree on and can work on, and use that topic to go through that exercise, go through that equity analysis worksheet. And so I'm going to give an example of what that exercise looks like. Bear with me for a second as I load the example. All right, okay, you can all see the screen now. So this is what the equity analysis tool looks like. And so at the very top, I asked you to choose a topic. So in this example, I choose the topic of public buses. And then using the same series of graphics, I ask you to analyze, using the symbolism in that graphic, analyze for equity around your issue. So when it comes to public buses, what does the baseball game represent? The baseball game represents the intended products or services. So public buses are that baseball game. Public buses are intended to provide an affordable means of transit for everyone. So very basic, very one-line sentence. What does that baseball game represent in terms of your issue? And then who are the game watchers? Both those inside the stadium and those fenced off in relation to your issue, right? Game watchers really represent the stakeholders and the impacted groups. So people inside the stadium represent the communities that already have access to high quality, affordable bus service, whereas people that are fenced off represent communities that experience some level of restricted access to high quality, affordable bus service. And the yellow person, the one that experiences the most barriers, represent communities that experience the most high cost or the most severely limited bus service. What does the uneven fence represent? Again, uneven fence represent existing barriers of access. So in terms of public buses, the uneven fence represents the uneven distribution of cost and bus service quality, bus routes, the bus frequency, etc., across different communities. What does the uneven ground represent? Again, the uneven ground represents the uneven history of oppression. So here, this is where we get really specific. Housing segregation, gentrification, displacement of people of color force people of color to live in far out communities that are not served well by public transit. So that is all the historical conditions that already put people of color back at a disadvantage when it comes to public buses. And there's also a legacy of employment and housing discrimination that has prevented people of color from accumulating generational wealth. This is when the issue becomes really complex and you have to think about various different things. It's not just about the bus itself, it's about all the other aspects of society, employment, housing. They prevent that history of discrimination around employment and housing prevented people of color from accumulating wealth that now prevents them from, or that now causes them to be less able to access different forms of transit, even if they are available. So the next question is, as a planner potentially working on this issue, what positions of power and privilege do you occupy in relation to the stakeholders that are involved? So this is speaking for myself. I have some level of power and privilege as a light-skinned Asian American, less privileged than my white colleagues, but more privileged than my Black and brown colleagues, and especially more privileged than maybe the Black and brown communities that I might be working with. I also have power and privilege stemming from my gender identity as a cisgender man, and my socioeconomic status and my educational status. Right? So given that all those positions of privilege I occupy, what actions or lack of action that I do would perpetuate and even worsen racial inequalities. So this is really a reflection on humility, where I'm asking you to think about how the actions that you take or the actions you don't take might be perpetuating racial inequality. So speaking for myself, in this situation, I might have engaged in top-down planning where communities of color were really only engaged in a perfunctory way, community outreach, that were done to simply check off the box for community outreach because it's required by law or something. But their feedback was not seriously discussed and incorporated into the final outcomes. So that's one way I might have worsened racial inequalities. So what are equity-based actions I might take instead to actually dismantle racist dynamics and advance racial justice? In the case of public buses, um, really engaging in communities in a collaborative process in which they get to define the parameters of what affordable means, what high quality means, and also ultimately creating the outcome of increasing bus service in historically underserved communities and maybe creating reduced or free fare programs for certain demographic groups. So it's a very simple exercise. You don't have to go through all the questions. It's a lot of questions. It's really meant to activate conversation amongst you all and to start you all thinking about what it takes to do an equity analysis, to think about an urban planning issue with an equity lens, right? So I am going to share the link now. So just take a moment to click on that link, download the Word document onto your computer. And then I am going to break you all out into groups of 3. So, and you will have about, let's see, 15 to 20 minutes to discuss the worksheet. Again, it's just an exercise. You don't have to think too deeply on it. What's more important is the conversations that happen amongst you all and the thinking that happens, right? So putting you all into groups of 2 to 3 people, or actually let's make it 3 to 4 people. And then we'll see you back here at about 11:15. All right. Hmm. Bob and Greg, are you in some kind of group? Oh, it would be great if you could have your video turned on because we'll be doing some share outs and we'll also move into Q&As and video is just better. But if you need to have your video turned off, that's okay too. So I want to spend a couple of minutes just giving a few of the breakout groups a chance to share out the highlights of your conversation. So you don't have to go through the entire worksheet with us. Just tell us what issue you worked on and what the conversation was like. What was the experience of doing this equity analysis for your issue? What were some of the, I guess, easy parts and the challenging parts? And what really resonated with you?
maybe we could go first.
Yeah, go
Allison,
ahead, Rima.
Greg, and I, just to break the ice. So Allison, Greg, and I chose to look at local waterfront revitalization project in a hypothetical rural upstate New York village. Just because of the nature of the work in the group, we thought this might be a more or less a good fit for the type of work we do. So, typically rural upstate villages are predominantly white. And this is a small rural village, so predominantly white, but do have some, seniors. And so we started out by thinking about what the baseball game represents, and that would be like water access to waterfront recreation, including like appropriate recreational uses, appropriate for that community, and a variety of different recreational opportunities. Do you guys want to jump in about can I share my screen so we can look at so they can look at the text?
Sure, yeah, if that's easier.
Yeah, because we don't all have a copy of it. So, yeah, Greg and Allison, please jump in if you would like. But we thought that the sort of the blue guy would represent like the people who had the most sort of economic resources, the people who already have invested in boats, for example, and higher socioeconomic statuses, people who have more money. And then also the people who are sort of in the know, like what they understand what a local waterfront revitalization project is, like developers who are really interested in like having a say in projects like that because it's in their economic interest to influence them. Sort of the middle person in red would be like able-bodied people who don't necessarily have a lot of income, but they're still able to recreate. You sort of have a full range of recreational opportunities. And people who just like, they live there and they know they might be aware that there's a park there or maybe not, but they're not like, they don't have a huge stake or interest in what's going on over there. And then the person who's most disadvantaged would be those with physical disabilities or limited mobility, lower income users, and those who are experiencing social and economic stressors.
Mm-hmm.
And Allison, you had an idea about, you were talking about, you didn't get to finish your thought on this part, so I don't know if you wanted to chime in here or.
I know I was talking when we ended, and I don't 100% remember what I was talking about.
Just sort of like what our positions of planners are as positions of power are as planners, and how that influences and how that relates to the stakeholders and the community.
Thank you. You're doing a great job summarizing. I think as planners, a lot of times we come up with the structure and the recommendations to who gets access to the planning process. So identifying, you should talk to community groups. And so one of the really big barriers to access is whether or not you have a community group and whether or not that community group is known. So, a lot of times there are neighborhood groups, but you know about them? Are you out in the community? Do you understand them? And making sure that everyone gets a seat at the table is difficult. Because you have to, it has to be sort of a lot of times the consultant will come in, I'm a consultant myself, you come in, you have a recommended list of who you might talk to, but it has to be the community who's saying, okay, well, we also want a seat at the table. And so planners from the community have to know those groups are out there. So a lot of it is just knowledge base, making sure that you understand who is in the community and who you're planning for. So working on that, I think, is one of the big challenges in any community to make sure that everyone is heard throughout the process. And so, from my perspective, I'm a lot involved with the actual process, but also sort of as it works in the community as well. So after the planning process is done.
Just to take, well, okay.
Yeah.
I apologize. I think one of the things that we wasn't part of it, that I've noticed is sort of position of privilege is being able to work from home, as I'm sure you can all see right now that mine's a little complicated right at the moment.
Yeah.
So just as a side note to add,
Yeah.
I feel very privileged that I'm able to work from home in this particular time.
Thank you so much, Rima and Allison. Yeah. And I love that how you got really specific. The barrier of access particular to your issue was neighborhood groups. If you didn't belong to one, you have a higher barrier to actually accessing the waterfront. And so that's the level of specificity that we really need to get at in these types of analysis. Of course, barriers also are sort of abstract, right? There's always some level of barrier based on income, based on social capital and social relationships. But there's also literal barriers like that are really great. Maybe let's do one more group.
I guess I can go. So I was in a group with Paige and Carrie, who are both from the Albany area, and I'm from the Buffalo area. And we chose to do bicycle paths. So we said that the baseball game represented access to a safe bicycle network that connects key nodes and people together. The inside are people who benefit from the bike path and have access to it, while the people outside are people who do not have easy access to it, or they do not benefit from the connections. The fence represents a lack of public participation from marginalized groups, lack of funding, differences in the treatment and maintenance of trails, and avoidance of certain neighborhoods. Whereas the uneven ground represented access to bicycles and safety equipment based on the amount of people's disposable income. I'd say that question was the one that we struggled with the most. As planners, all three of us are educated white women. We have flexible jobs and resources that would allow us to participate in meetings and say in where bicycle paths might go, and that we also have the professional vocabulary to talk in an educated way about these issues, which might give us a stronger say. And then what actions or lack of actions would perpetuate or worsen the racial inequalities. We're starting to talk about further expansions into whiter and wealthier areas versus our urban communities, which tend to have poorer and racial minorities. That's as far as we got in our group.
That's great. Thank you, Kaylee. And the thing I love about what you just said, one of the things was the professional vocabulary. I think a lot of us don't think about that as a form of socioeconomic and educational privilege that plays a huge role. If you're in a very diverse public gathering, for example, who gets more legitimacy, who gets heard more based on how they sound, right? And what words they use, and who's able to speak the lingo and the jargon of the work that we all do. That is one of those unconscious biases that play a huge role in shaping how much power people have in the planning process. So that was a really quick exercise, and these exercises should never be done alone. You could do it alone, and you could probably come up with a really great analysis, but they're always best done in a group, and they're always actually best done in community. So this is an example of one way an equity analysis can be done using a worksheet, but most equity analyses are more comprehensive and they're more elaborate, and they're usually done in conjunction with communities, because communities really provide that perspective that we as planners may not have. And so I encourage you to do equity analyses always with people, not just yourself, with your colleagues, with partners, and with communities. And I hope that was a good taste of what an equity analysis looks like for you. I want to leave the rest of the time to questioning Q&A. If folks have any questions.
We did get one earlier in the chat, and lost my Word document where I memorialized it. It was, do you have any particular recommendations or suggestions for racial or social justice authors we should invest time in?
Yes, I did see that question. So while you were all in the breakout group, I compiled a short list. There's so much literature out there, I don't want to overwhelm you. So I'm going to give a couple. Some are urban planning related, some are more general. So The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson is urban planning related. How to Be Anti-Racist is a very famous book. You probably all heard about it. That's not necessarily urban planning related, but it's a really great book. From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime is urban planning related. The Color of Law is urban planning related. And So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo is not urban planning related, but if one of the skills in being an anti-racist planner and just being an anti-racist person in general is being able to talk about race. And so her book is really a great resource on that.
Great. So another question came in. How can we eliminate racism in a data-driven planning process? For instance, how would you resolve a situation if the data does not support public opinion voiced by a marginalized group?
Ooh, good question. Yeah, so data is complicated and you know, data is not inherently objective. Data can also be biased. And the emerging conversation, especially in the tech world and AI, is AI can be very biased because AI is designed by humans who are biased themselves. So they build biases into the AI, into our tech. And the same thing with data. Data does not come from itself. It comes from people, and people who design assessment processes, who design research processes, build their biases into those processes. And so the data might also be biased. So that's one thing, but let's just assume the data is objective. How do you reconcile that? Well, one is to know that data is one source of knowledge, right? That empirical statistical data that you gather using numbers and analyses, that's one form of knowledge. It has to be balanced with other forms of knowledge, community opinion. And you can't just say, well, data reigns supreme and leave the conversation at that. The data is ultimately a tool, it's a resource, and you have to balance it with other forms of knowledge, other forms of expertise. And so if there's a case where the data is saying something different from the community, present that data to the community and don't present it in a confrontational way like, hey, this is what we're hearing you say, but the data says something different. Don't present it as a confrontational thing. Say, we hear you. Here's also what the data is showing. What is happening here? What's the situation? How can we reconcile these differences? So actually engage it as a learning conversation, not as a, well, data says this, so you're wrong kind of attitude. So that's one approach to reconciling. It's just having a more honest conversation about different forms of knowledge and what might be more important in a particular moment. The data could say something that's very different, but if the community says, yes, but this is not what we need right now, this is what we want to prioritize right now, then you'd have to balance that. Data does not reign supreme. Data is ultimately one tool.
Great. Let's see, one other one came in. Current development regulations typically protect property investments. What might development regulations intended to equitably build wealth look like?
Well, I am not an expert in development regulations. So if anyone is an expert, I welcome you to chime in, but let me think on that question.
Great. And then another one. The AICP Code of Ethics, Section A, contains statements of aspirational principles that constitute the ideals to which planners are committed, including the statement, "We shall seek social justice by working to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of the disadvantaged, and to promote racial and economic integration." Do you feel planning offices would benefit from creating their own code of ethics for their practitioners, or that such codes may appear only to pay lip service to social justice?
Create their own code of ethics that's different from the APA one?
I think it would be complementary to, or like in addition to, like the office's own statement of practice.
The answer is
Recognizing that
yes.
not everyone
Yeah.
has
Yeah.
AICP.
Yeah. I think I get it. It depends. The answer is it depends on which office and who's doing it. The AICP and the APA code of ethics is meant to be standardized. It's meant to be general, applicable across the nation. So it's going to be a bit generic. It's going to be a bit abstract. So it's always helpful if you're particularly motivated to create more specific code of ethics for your office, for your municipality. That's always helpful. Whether it's just simply lip service is really up to you all. Again, these are tools. Code of ethics are tools. So are you creating this tool to really use it, to really be guided by it, or just to look good? I can't say that for you. The code of ethics is not inherently good or bad. It's just a tool, and your motivations for creating it for your office is ultimately up to you. So use it if you really want to be guided by it. If you want to just pay lip service to it, then of course it's not going to do anything.
Great. Maybe time for one more. How do we work to be an anti-racist in government entities, which can sometimes be led by elected officials who don't buy into anti-racism and may not see the same issues planners do?
Yeah, that is a skill in negotiation and confronting power, hierarchical power, oppressive power. And there is a term or concept in social justice work called liberatory gatekeeping. And so, especially for planners, we're not often the ultimate decision makers, right? We plan, but really it's our lawmakers, it's our mayors and city councils and governors that make these really important decisions. We're sort of the middle people. And so we play what's called gatekeeping roles. We are participating in all these different social systems, and we gatekeep. We're also gatekept by other people. We're all in this system together. And so what does it mean to be an anti-racist gatekeeper? It means using whatever position of privilege you have to push for racial justice whenever you can, knowing that you don't always have the power to do so, right? I live and work in New York City, and so many urban planners in New York City are in that very dilemma where they do the work, but they're not the ultimate decision makers. The mayor is, the city council is, different other decision maker bodies are the decision makers. And so this past summer, when we were talking about anti-Black police violence, what a lot of these planners did and a lot of other city agencies, employees did was they banded together and rallied to push Mayor de Blasio to defund the police. So in those moments, you're not the decision makers, but you do, all of us together are leveraging our positions of power and privilege to push our elected officials to advance racial justice. So it's really having a nuanced awareness of your positions of power, whatever they may be, and using them whenever possible. Knowing that you won't always be successful and you won't always have those opportunities. So it's a game in negotiation. It's a game in leveraging your positions whenever possible. It's not a I'm either being anti-racist in government or I'm not. It's a gatekeeping process, and we all have to engage in it whenever we can.
Great, thank you. I don't see any more questions at this time.
Hey, Paige, this is Marcus Stiglione here. I just wanted to make a statement on behalf of the chapter board here. Marcus Stiglione here. I'm the president of Upstate APA. So excited to have Daniel Lim lead us with this session. It's super important for planners to get a deeper understanding of how they can affect change in this space. In addition, the chapter board is very interested in how we continue this conversation organizationally to ensure that we are investing and focusing on equity issues as an organization of professional planners. So in that regard, these two sessions for us is really a starting point of a continuing conversation about how we engage people of color and minorities in our organizational leadership and have that permeate into the benefits that we derive to our members. So, again, this is the start of a conversation. What struck me in my conversation with my partner as we worked through the worksheet, we focused on the organization of Upstate APA. And by and large, those that are participating in it were invited in. And we get invited in by people we know. And if we don't know any people of color, they're not going to be invited in. So we need to compensate for that. And so that's the work that we need to do. And that's the work that we should be focusing on as an outcome of this conference. So again, thank you, Daniel, and thank you to the conference committee for focusing on this topic.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
Well, if, go ahead.
I
If
was
there are
gonna-
no, yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't answer the question on development regulations. I really don't have the knowledge to do so. But I was happy to answer the other questions, and I'm really grateful and happy to have gotten to do this training for you all in yesterday's talk. So it was great to meet all of you. And thank you again to the APA New York Upstate chapter for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, Daniel, for the talk yesterday and for the great training today. Thank you all for attending. I want to just let you know that this training is being recorded, and when it gets uploaded, we'll let all of you know so that you can access it later on. I hope you're able to enjoy attend some of the other conference sessions that we have planned. There's at least 1 to 2 every week into November. And I especially want to call out your attention to a companion panel that's happening next week called Planning While Black. It's a young planners panel of several fantastic ladies who are going to talk about their experiences as professional planners. So I hope you all can make that one as well. I think that covers everything. So thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you in some other sessions.
Yeah. One more thing I totally forgot. I just sent a link to an action planning tool that's for your own personal tool to think through how to be an anti-racist planner. So just share the link, and we can share the link via email again.
Thank you, Daniel. Goodbye, everyone.